Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name's Beth Cohen and today we'll be talking about World War II and remembering Neus Català. On the 8th of May 1945, the Second World War came to an end in Europe. This occasion is commemorated annually as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. 80 years on, we reflect on how Catalonia was affected by the conflict and highlight the remarkable story of Neus Català, an anti-fascist resistance fighter and holocaust survivor from Tarragona. Joining me in the studio today are Beliaeva Banda and Cillian Shields. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for coming in. So before we get into detail, Cillian, can you give us a brief overview of the events leading up to World War II and Catalonia's involvement in the conflict?
Yes, of course. So Spain officially remained neutral in World War II, but obviously Francisco Franco was closely aligned with the Axis powers of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. Catalonia was deeply affected by this whole period of time. Many, in fact, view the Spanish Civil War, which immediately preceded the Second World War from 1936 to 1939. Many people view this as the first battle of the Second World War. It was one of the first ideological wars in history between the democratically elected left-wing Republican side and Franco's right-wing nationalists, who ultimately won the war after their coup d'etat and held Spain under a dictatorship for almost 4 decades. After this victory, many Spanish and Catalan Republicans fled into exile, many of whom joined the French resistance and saw the Second World War as a continuation of the same fight.
And Leah, who was Neus Català?
Neus Català, she was a lifelong communist and anti-fascist, as you mentioned before. She was born in 1915 in the Catalan village of Els Guiamets in southern Catalonia. Her parents were farmers, and especially her father played a big role in her political awakening. From a young age, she had egalitarian ideas, and she became politically active first in the Unified Socialist Youth of Catalonia, and later she joined the Communist Party PSUC. And one thing that characterizes her activism throughout her whole life is that of working in a network.
And what happened later in her life?
So, in short, after she was liberated from the concentration camp, she dedicated her life to preserving historical memory, which we will hear much more about. And she also received many awards throughout her life, such as the Sant Jordi Cross and the Golden Medal from the Catalan government.
To find out more about Neus Català, we spoke with Ricard Ribera Llorens, president of the Fundació Neus Català, and Dr. Alejandro Acosta, contemporary historian at the Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. Let's hear those interviews.
I think that Neus Català was an example of what could happen if you were brave enough to fight the Nazis.
Alejandro Acosta is an historian whose focus includes the plight of Catalan and Spanish refugees in France following the Civil War, which includes Neus Català.
Meanwhile, president of the Neus Català Foundation, Ricard Ribera, says that Català shouldn't only be remembered as a concentration camp survivor, but for her whole lifetime of fighting fascism.
És una militant comunista durant tota la seva vida.
Her whole life she was a member of the Communist Party, and it's through this left-wing political activism that she actively joins the fight against fascism, Nazism and all systemic inequalities, starting at a very young age in the town of Els Guiamets and lasting until her last days.
As a young girl, Català was inspired by a doctor who sought refuge near her hometown, and she decided to become a nurse to help people. She moved to Barcelona to study in 1937 amid the Civil War, before being stationed near the French border looking after orphaned children. As Franco's forces approached, hundreds of thousands were forced to flee north.
Hundreds of thousands of people had to flee on foot to the French border, terrified by fascism and carrying them with suitcases, household goods, and all sorts of their belongings. And when we talk about the retirada, when we talk about the Republican exile, we must think that it was one of the saddest and most tragic episodes of the 20th century in Spain.
In 1939, Neus Català, along with 182 orphans she was accompanying, crossed the border into France to escape the approaching Franquist forces, who had just taken over Barcelona on the same day. She would later say that saving those children was the greatest achievement of her life.
Children, from now on you have to do it like the soldiers and wrap your blankets around the neck. You can lose anything but the blankets. I don't want you to freeze to death.
That's our colleague Gigi, who will be reading out some quotes directly from Català taken from her biography, Neus Català, Memory and Struggle, by Elisenda Belenguer Mercader.
She was among the 450,000 Republicans, around 1/3 of whom were Catalan, who crossed into France at this time, where the refugees were not treated well.
First of all, when we talk about the involvement of Catalans in the French resistance, we must take into account the harsh situation they lived when they arrived to France. When they crossed the border, all the Catalans were installed in internment camps, normally close to the border and close to the beach, in villages like Saint-Cyprien or Algeciras, and their living conditions were very harsh. They lived in the open, without electricity, in the cold, with very little food, and so on.
The most heartbreaking part for me was, on one hand, to see the women and children cross the border, and on the other, to see the Republican soldiers who had been fighting for 32 months with such heroism and bravery having to lay down their arms. That was a really hard blow for me.
The Spanish Civil War ended in 1939, but these exiled Republicans knew that Spain was just the first battle in a larger war that had only just begun.
En aquell moment no en va tenir prou en sortir de 3 anys de guerra I sortir d'una derrota de la democràcia.
At that time, it wasn't just about coming out of 3 years of war and experiencing the defeat of democracy, because in France they were very aware that the fight that had begun in Spain and Catalonia in 1936 was continuing there. The fight against fascism was taking on a European scale and wasn't something separate to what they had been doing up until that point. Neus became actively involved in the resistance where she lived in France.
In the very first moments, these groups made propaganda against the Nazis, tried to hide people who were persecuted, etc. And some Catalans integrated themselves in these French resistance groups. But nevertheless, especially after November 1940, some Catalans organized themselves and created the first resistance groups formed exclusively by Catalans. Some of them even participated in the liberation of the country, and many of them participated even in the liberation of Paris in August 1944. This is the history of the Catalans who fought in the resistance in the armies of de Gaulle. But there were some other Catalans that fought in the inner territory. They became partisans, they became maquisards. They fought in the inner resistance. These Catalans who fought the Nazi occupation from within were usually communists, also some anarchists, but especially communists, and they organized themselves very quickly.
Català was one of the communist women who joined the resistance in inland France. At first, she worked alone, cycling from town to town, trying to spread information and asking people not to collaborate with the Nazis.
I told them that if Hitler won the war, France would disappear. It would stop existing as a nation. I also told them what the Germans were really like, because they still didn't know, and that all the Frenchmen would suffer under the Germans, and that's why they needed to fight for France's freedom.
The advantage that these women had was that in a patriarchal world, in the eyes of the collaborationist gendarmeries, the women were not suspicious. Whatever a woman could do, it was considered harmless. So that many women, such as Neus Català, carried messages. They participated in the escape networks that aided many people to escape the French territory and save their lives. Women also participated providing food to the guerrillas. They used to give wrong information to the Nazis in order to confuse them.
By 1943, Català and her first husband were actively working in the French resistance.
I consider that the role of the women was very important and normally very forgotten. In fact, Neus Català put her house at the service of the anti-Nazi struggle. Weapons sensitive documentation, political refugees were hidden in Neus Català's own house in France.
I just quan ella i la seva parella...
Just when they had decided to move to another area because they were burned out and too many people knew that they were active in the resistance, Català and her husband were exposed.
The problem was that a man, a neighbor of hers, an apothecary of the village of Sarlat, who probably was suspicious of the movements in Neus Català's house, decided to denounce her. Neus Català and his first husband were detained. They were sent to the prison. They were beaten, tortured, etc. In the city of Limoges. After this experience, Neus Català was sent to a Nazi concentration camp, the Nazi camp of Ravensbrück.
In her biography, she explains that her profound hatred for the Nazis was what helped her keep grounded during the torture.
They beat me up good. My poor head was hit so many times. I used all my strength not to lose consciousness, and I concentrated however I could on the hatred that I felt towards the Nazis. I didn't want to give them the pleasure of seeing me fall onto the ground, and I helped myself up.
Both in Limoges and later in the concentration camp Holleischen after Ravensbrück, Neus would organise resistance work.
It was important to give and receive information about what was happening on the outside to lift our morale, because there's nothing like being isolated and cut off from communication in prison.
In January 1944, she was deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, the largest one for women, just north of Berlin. The concentration camp had been built to house 3,000 people, but when Neus arrived, 10,000 women were imprisoned.
The descriptions of hell in Dante's Divine Comedy are nothing compared to Ravensbrück. Dante didn't really know what hell was.
Català and the other prisoners were forced into hard labour, starved, had medicine withheld, tortured and even experimented on medically. At the camp, women received injections that stopped their periods. Neus didn't get her period between 1944 and 1951 and thought that she had become infertile. To survive the horrors of Ravensbrück, Neus adopted different strategies of survival.
Exercising the mind in order not to become an animal, which is what the Nazis wanted. Keeping the solidarity and not losing dignity.
In Ravensbrück, the women would share their food, save pieces of bread for the children, and create family-like bonds, naming each other mother or daughter depending on the age. Català learned German, and on Sundays the women would teach each other things and sing together not to lose spirit.
In the spring of 1944, Català and the others were moved to the women's concentration camp Holleischen, located in modern-day Czechia. There, she and the other women were forced to work in the munitions factory to produce war material.
It was the biggest moral challenge of our lives, but we chose to accept it, knowing that if we didn't, they would eliminate us, and we would be replaced by others.
There, Català joined the Lazy Brigade, a group of women who actively participated in sabotaging the weaponry production within the camp.
They, for example, reduced the diameter of the base of the bullets, they destroyed some machines, etc. It is estimated that thanks to this sabotage, they rendered some 10 million bullets useless.
Finally, on May 5th, 1945, Holleischen was liberated and Català was finally free. However, after the Second World War, she returned not to live in Spain, but in France.
Franco's regime after the Second World War was consolidated. The Catalan anti-fascistas could not return to their country. If they tried to return to Spain, they would be judged. Maybe they would be imprisoned, or at the best, they would have to live a life of silence, of oblivion, and in a very suffocating political climate. A very suffocating political climate awaited them in Spain. For this reason, the majority of them settled in France.
Once back in the country, the reception from the French Red Cross was anything but warm.
They told us, if you had stayed at home and washed your children's diapers, nothing would have happened to you.
But some days later, her train passed by a rural French town, and there they were welcomed quite differently.
The farmers there gave us the best they could offer to eat. They gave us flowers and hugged us.
2 years after her liberation, Català returned to activism. She first joined the group that helped former deportees, and later joined a movement of exiled Republican women within the Spanish Communist Party, which was organized in France.
Una tasca de dedicar-se a organitzar les dones republicanes a l'exili.
She was given the task of organising the Republican woman in exile because they thought that she, as a woman who had survived the Nazi camp, had certain legitimacy, which would make it easier for people to listen to her.
She later became the editor-in-chief of a political newspaper that wrote about what was happening in Franco's Spain.
But without using qualifying adjectives, because I wanted the readers to figure out on their own that the dictator was a criminal.
In 1950, the French government prohibited much of the work of exiled Spanish Republicans, including her paper. Neus characterized this as a witch hunt, but kept working anyway.
Ella, malgrat estar a l'exili, continua treballant.
Despite being in exile, she continued working actively in the anti-Francoist movement, and later, after she had gained French nationality, she became a great asset to the party because she could cross the border without suspicion. So, she was the link to deliver information and messages to comrades on the inside, which was a very dangerous job.
Us women had a double role, because the men didn't know how to do the work of a woman. We also had to awaken women's political consciousness to make them see that they exist and that they had something to bring to the table. We had fought for the Republic, and we would continue to work towards the liberation of Spain.
Ella fa un treball molt extens.
She did the very extensive work of collecting and documenting the testimonies of the Spanish Republicans who had been imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, particularly of Spanish Republican women, stories that, for a very long time, society was unaware of. The stories of those that she called the forgotten of the forgotten.
In the 1960s, during a political conference, Català got to know other people who had been through similar experiences that she had, and co-founded the Association Amical of Mauthausen and other camps, and of all the victims of Nazism in Spain. This group was founded in secrecy, as such a thing was still outlawed under Franco. The goal was to gather survivors and foster a support network, but also to gather a strong team of lawyers to apply for widowers' pensions in Germany. The association was not legalized until 1978, after the transition to democracy in Spain.
During the last decades of her life, Neus Català tried to foster the memory of these Catalan anti-fascistas. She tried to spread her witness, and she tried to recover the role of the women who participated in the Catalan resistance.
It was us, the deportees, who began recovering the democratic memory in Spain.
Neus Català passed away in 2019 after a lifetime of fighting injustice, and the Neus Català Foundation was founded in 2023.
Recuperar aquesta vida i aquell llegat de Neus Català i pallejar com a militant comunista.
The foundation works to continue the legacy of Neus Català as a member of the communist movement and an anti-fascist fighter, to work on historical memory, and for Neus and other comrades to be a guiding light in the fight against fascism and the far right today.
According to Ricard, education is one of the most important ways of combating fascism and the far right today.
Perquè estem convençuts que
We are convinced that anti-fascism is the basis, the key to democracy. We must go back to giving a social and human depth to the word democracy. It's not just a methodology of casting your vote.
For the foundation, it's also important to ensure that what happened in the past doesn't happen again. And one way of doing so is by putting history in a contemporary context.
és cert que ens cal, evidentment...
It's important that history does not repeat itself. That means not returning to a situation where we have to explicitly fight fascism, but also to become aware and be willing to fight against inequality. Social problems like access to housing can also form part of the fight against fascism, the fight to achieve decent living conditions.
If people are living under duress and suffering, they may be more susceptible to the allure of fascist movements that seek to blame other groups for the hardship in their own lives. When we talk about far-right and fascist movements today, it's important to understand them and understand why they exist, Ricard says.
L'extrema-dreta té aquesta vocació política clara.
There is an important need to spread awareness among the working classes. This is true of the 1920s, 30s and 40s, and also today. But I think it's a bit simplistic to identify the far right or fascism only from what we know from then, although the far right today has many things in common with the far right of the 20th century.
One of the major challenges when confronting fascism and the far right, Ricard says, is its adaptability to any moment in history and any economic and social context, whether it's labeled fascism or not.
Però l'extrema dreta té aquesta funció històrica de disciplinar les classes populars i dividir-les entre elles.
The far right has historically managed to engage the working classes and divide them during times of crisis, be they economic, social or other crisis, to shake the foundation of the political and social system. And that's when the resurgence of the far right starts to make sense again, which has been happening for quite a few years now, in a moment where precarious living conditions are so prevalent in our lives.
The rise in far-right movements across the globe today shows just how diverse they are.
A dia d'avui, l'extrema dreta pren...
We see far-right movements that focus on identity politics, or one that is post-Francoist. Or in Europe, in the case of Germany, we see them co-opting women's rights in some contexts. Something we wouldn't necessarily consider the old-fashioned far-right discourse, so the movement adapts itself. We can also talk about the far-right movement of Milei in Argentina, which is anarcho-capitalist and ultra-liberal, and can clash with the idea that we have of a far-right that is hierarchical and community-based. They are creating a type of far-right that is more centred around individualism and in going against the state. But they're also far-right, let's be clear on that. And then also with Trump's second mandate, we've seen how his first 100 days in office is becoming a guide for the far right around the world and is marking clearly what the plan is, which then allows them to lose their insecurities and do the Roman salute without being concerned, which is something that just 6 months ago would have seemed surreal.
What we can learn from Neus Català today, Ricard says, is the importance of peace, something she valued dearly. In her biography, she explains seeing American airplanes bombing German cities when she was returning to France after her liberation, which made her cry, much to the surprise of the other women.
Seeing how the Americans flaunted their military power by bombing non-stop. There was no other military sign in the sky. These birds smelled like the ravens of Ravensbrück, and surely somewhere on earth, a war must be taking place.
Thanks to Alejandro Acosta and Ricard Ribera Llorens for speaking with us.
What a life, really and truly. I think it's really amazing how her life covers all of the major tragedies of the 20th century. I mean, she suffered the Spanish Civil War, she was forced into exile, she suffered through the Second World War, she was imprisoned in concentration camps, and even after that, she still wasn't able to return to her home country. I think it's just extraordinary how, after all of this, she still faced life with such positivity and had so much energy to continue fighting for a better world.
Yeah, Neus Català's life mission after being liberated from the concentration camp was to preserve the historic memory of those atrocities.
Yeah, and she wrote the book De la Resistencia y la Deportació, 50 Testimonis de Dones Españolas. And basically for her, it was really important never to forget what happened and that the stories of what happened were conveyed.
That's almost all we have time for today. But before we go, it's time for our Catalan phrase of the week. Leah, what do we have?
So this week we chose a quote from Neus, and it's La única mort que em preocupa es la mort de la memoria.
The only death which worries me is the death of memory. This week on Filling the Sink, we've been talking about how Catalonia was affected by World War II and remembering Neus Català. Thank you to everyone who spoke with us, and of course thank you to Leah and Cillian for joining me.
Moltes gracias.
Thanks to you.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening. Make sure to subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. We'll be back again next Saturday with another exciting episode of Filling the Sink. On behalf of all the team here at Catalan News, I'm Beth Cohen, wishing you a great weekend. Fins aviat. Adeu.